There are many reasons why you would want to build or not build a router sled, and I have my own. Let me show you how I built my very own DIY router sled. I'm starting off with a new sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, which will be the base of the router sled. That's the sheet at the bottom. On the top I have another sheet which I will cut a few 2-inch wide strips over the entire length of the sheet. These strips will be used as spacers below the bottom rails of the router sled, and you will see in a moment why this is important. I'm making use of my Makita track saw for these cuts. The Makita is a great tool. It's smooth and glides on the track, and it makes clean and precise cuts. I'm going to cut 4 strips in total, 2 for each rail. Now that I'm finished cutting the plywood strips, I'm adding wood glue to the first plywood strip in order to get a permanent bond between the plywood sheet and the strip. This does not take long, and before we knew it, the strip is ready. The plywood strip is now put in place, and I used a few drywall screws to secure it. The screws are actually also acting as clamps, so I don't need to hold the plywood strip in place with a gazillion clamps. Now that the first plywood strip is in place, I just need to repeat the step a couple of times more. I apply glue to the second plywood strip, just to ensure that we get a permanent bond between the first and the second plywood strips. Again, I'm using some drywall screws to act as clamps. For the bottom rails, I'm using the 16mm variant as well as the SBR 16W linear bearing blocks. The total length of the total rails is almost 8 foot. The top rails are the 20mm variant, as they are more rigid than the 16mm, which in theory should give less structural deflection. The top rails are almost 5 feet long. The holes on the rails actually line up with the holes on the bearing blocks, so I had to secure it with a couple of M5 machine screws. For the sled, I'm using a combination of 2-inch aluminum angle as well as 3/4 inch plywood. Aluminum is a non-ferrous metal and it can be cut with a miter saw. I try to accurately mark out the mounting holes, which will secure the aluminum angle to the linear bearings. First I drill some pilot holes, and then I drill it to its final size, which will be slightly larger than the actual machine screw. This will just give a little bit more room should the holes not line up perfectly. Just a couple more holes to drill and we'll be ready to fit the bearing blocks. Just before fitting the bearing blocks, it's important to just deburr the holes. It's just to remove the sharp edges on the holes. I then pre-drilled the holes in the plywood to avoid splitting of the wood when the screws are driven in. Now for the ultimate test to see how well I drilled these holes. But luckily, with them being slightly oversized, the machine screws fitted just perfectly. With the sled in place, I added some aluminum angles just to add stiffness to the structure. This will prevent the sled from binding onto the rails once being used. If everything was lined up properly, then the whole assembly glides smooth without any binding to the rails. So far it's looking good. I've tested it in all the directions, but luckily I did not have to adjust anything. I marked the positions where the router and the dust extraction port will go. I made the base plate just big enough to fit the router and the dust extraction port so that I can maximize the size of slab that I can flatten. With the mounting positions marked, I then drilled holes with a 2.5 inch hole saw. The dust extraction port is secured with a few drywall screws, which is just long enough not to penetrate the opposite side of the base plate. The dust port sits nicely on the base plate, not entirely flush, but it's kind of low profile. Now I'm just mounting the router to the base plate, and unfortunately my camera battery died during the assembly, so I cannot show that. With the slab on the table and everything hooked up to the sled, it's time to test the router sled. I'm making shallow passes over the slab, only taking off about 1/8 of an inch at a time or less. I'm also making sure to overlap each pass to avoid tear out, especially on the epoxy. This is a fairly small router bit that I've used initially, and since I've purchased a 2.5 inch spoilboard bit, this router sled works extremely well. However, one improvement that I'm considering is adding a CNC dust shoe brush to the base plate, just to remove more of the cuttings and dust. Overall, I'm very happy with the results, and for my situation, this is money well spent. Thanks for watching.